Sometimes life leaves you with impossible choices that break your heart before they save your soul. In the harsh mountains of 1800s Montana, 20-year-old Abigail Henderson faces starvation alone in her crumbling cabin. When rugged mountain man Silas McGraw arrives at her door, he makes a shocking demand. "From tonight on, you exist to birth my sons," he declares. It's not love, it's survival. But in the untamed wilderness, this desperate arrangement becomes something neither expected. What happens when two broken souls must depend on each other to survive? Can real love bloom from the harshest beginnings? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gold band. On Abigail Henderson's finger caught what little morning light filtered through the cabin's cracked window. It had belonged to her mother, the only thing of value she had left in this world, and the only reminder of a time when love meant something. Gentle and sure, she twisted it now, her fingers trembling not from the October cold, but from the memory of the man who'd stood at her door 3 days ago, his shadow filling the entire frame. Silas McGraw wasn't a man who asked for anything. He stated facts the way other men mentioned the weather. "Winter's coming hard," he'd said, his steel-grey eyes taking in her hollow cheeks and the emptiness of her shelves. "You won't survive it alone?" She'd known he was right. The summer had been cruel. Drought followed by sudden floods that washed away her small garden. The few neighbors who'd remained in these remote mountains had moved on to easier country, leaving her the sole inhabitant of what had once been a modest settlement. Her parents had died 2 winters ago, victims of a fever that swept through faster than help could arrive. At 18, she'd been confident she could manage alone. At 20, staring at her last handful of flour and a winter that promised to be the harshest in memory, confidence felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Silas had waited while she absorbed his assessment of her situation. He stood with the patience of a man accustomed to letting the mountains speak first. When she finally met his eyes, he'd continued with the same matter-of-fact tone. "I got a cabin that'll keep you warm and fed. Got supplies to see you through till spring, and knowledge to keep you alive after that." The pause that followed stretched, longer than the shadows creeping across her floor. She'd watched his weathered hands rest at his sides, noting the careful way he held himself, not threatening, but not apologetic either. This wasn't a man who made offers lightly. "What would you want in return?" she'd asked, though some part of her already knew the answer would change everything. His response still echoed in her mind now. "From tonight on, you exist to birth my sons." The words had hit her like a physical blow, not because they were violent, but because they were so utterly practical. No pretty words about love or companionship, no promises of happiness. Just the raw truth of what he needed and what he was willing to provide in exchange. Abigail had spent the last 3 days wrestling with that truth, while her stomach grew emptier and the nights grew colder. She'd walked through her cabin, cataloguing everything she owned. Her mother's sewing kit, her father's few books, a handful of her own possessions that seemed suddenly meaningless against the weight of survival. The walls seemed to close in on her as she imagined the long winter ahead, alone with nothing but her pride for company. Silas McGraw was known throughout these mountains, though few had actually spoken with him. He'd appeared nearly a decade ago, a man already seasoned by loss and hardship, claiming a homestead in the most remote reaches of the territory. Stories about him varied depending on who told them. Some said he'd been a scout for the army, others claimed he was running from something back east. A few whispered he'd lost a wife and child, though no one seemed to know the details. What everyone agreed on was his competence. Silas McGraw survived where other men failed. His cabin was solid and well-stocked. His trapping brought in enough fur to trade for supplies twice a year when he made his rare trips to town. He knew these mountains like other men knew their own. backyards, and he'd helped more than one desperate soul make it through a crisis. He was also a man without a family, pushing 40 with no sons to help with the work or carry on his name. In a place where survival often depended on having enough hands to manage the endless tasks of frontier life, his situation was as precarious as her own. The hunting knife at his belt, she'd noticed, was old and well-maintained, the kind of tool passed down from father to son. The worn handle suggested generations of use, and she wondered if he'd inherited it from his own father, if it represented the kind of legacy he hoped to create in these unforgiving mountains. When she'd asked him why her, why not find a wife? In town where women had more choices and better prospects, his answer had been characteristically direct. Town women want things I can't give them. Churches and neighbors and stores within walking distance. They want a different kind of life than what these mountains offer. He'd paused, studying her face with those penetrating eyes. You already know what it means to live out here. You know the cost, and you're still here. That tells me something about your character. The compliment, if it was one, felt strange coming from him. Silas McGraw didn't seem like a man given to flattery, which somehow made his words carry more weight. He saw her not as a desperate woman to be taken advantage of, but as someone who'd proven herself capable of handling hardship. I won't lie to you about what I'm offering, he'd continued. It won't be easy, and it won't be what most women dream of. But you'll be fed and warm and safe, and any children we have will be provided for. I don't drink to excess. I don't have a temper, and I pay my debts. If you can say the same about most men, you've been lucky. She'd asked for time to consider, and he'd given it to her without argument. I'll be back in 3 days, he'd said. If you decide yes, be ready to come with me then. If you decide no, I'll respect that choice and not trouble you again. The respect in his voice had surprised her. This wasn't a man trying to pressure or manipulate her into submission. He was offering a bargain between equals, even if the terms were starker than anything she'd ever imagined. Now, sitting in her childhood cabin as the sun set on the 3rd day, Abigail faced the reality of her choice. She could maintain her independence, and almost certainly die before spring, or she could accept Silas's proposition and trade her freedom for survival. But was it really freedom she'd be giving up, or just the illusion of it? What good was independence if it led to death by starvation? What value did her dignity have if no one was left to remember it? She thought of her parents, buried in the small cemetery that had once served the settlement. They'd been practical, people who'd made difficult choices to build a life in this harsh country. Would they understand her decision, or would they be horrified by what she was contemplating? The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Silas McGraw riding up the trail, arriving exactly when he'd promised. He sat his horse with the same steady confidence he brought to everything else, a man comfortable with the weight of his own decisions. Her mother's wedding ring seemed to grow heavier on her finger as she watched him dismount. In a few minutes, she would have to give him her answer, and whatever she chose would determine not just whether she lived or died, but who she would become. Silas knocked once, firmly, but not impatiently. When she opened the door, he removed his hat and waited for her to speak first. His eyes took in her packed belongings, sitting near the door, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I accept your offer." He nodded once, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then we'd better get you settled before dark. These mountains don't forgive delays." As she picked up her bags and followed him toward his waiting horse, Abigail touched her mother's ring one last time. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer the frightened girl who'd been left alone in the wilderness. She was a woman who'd made an impossible choice and would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The marriage certificate lay flat on Silas's kitchen table, the ink still wet from the traveling preacher's careful script. Reverend Morrison had asked no questions when Silas requested the ceremony. though his weathered face had shown concern for the young woman who stood beside the mountain man with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on the floor. "Do you, Abigail Henderson, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" The preacher's voice had carried the weight of ceremony, even in the humble surroundings of Silas's cabin. "I do." The words had come out smaller than she'd intended, barely more than a whisper in the lamplight. "And do you, Silas McGraw, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" "I do." His response had been firm, final, like a man closing a business deal he'd carefully considered. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." No kiss had followed, no celebration or even smiles. Reverend Morrison had packed his Bible and accepted the coins Silas offered, mounting his horse with a tip of his hat and a promise to remember them in his prayers. The whole ceremony had taken less than 10 minutes, but it had changed everything. Now, 2 hours later, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed in what had suddenly become her home, still wearing the simple blue dress she'd chosen for what passed as her wedding day. Silas had given her time to settle in, to explore the cabin and understand the space that would define her new life. It was larger than her family's place had been, with a proper kitchen, a sitting area with actual store-bought furniture, and shelves lined with more books than she'd expected to find. The bedroom held a sturdy bed with a real mattress, not just a pile of furs and blankets. Everything spoke of a man who'd taken time to build something substantial, something meant to last. This wasn't the rough shelter of a temporary settler, but the home of someone who intended to stay. Silas appeared in the doorway, having given her privacy to prepare herself. He'd changed into a clean shirt and taken time to wash, though his hair still bore the marks of where his hat had pressed it down. In the lamplight, she could see the careful way he held himself, aware that this moment carried significance for both of them. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Everything about this situation felt surreal. Married to a stranger in his cabin, about to fulfill the bargain that had saved her life. Silas approached slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. When he sat on the edge of the bed beside her, she could smell the soap he'd used and the lingering scent of wood smoke that seemed to cling to everything in the cabin. "Abigail," he said, and hearing her name in his voice made everything suddenly more real. "I want you to understand something. What we agreed to, it doesn't mean I intend to treat you poorly. This arrangement benefits us both, but that doesn't mean it has to be unpleasant." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his expression she hadn't noticed before. Beneath the practical exterior, there was uncertainty. This man who seemed so confident about everything else was unsure about how to handle this moment. "I've never been married before," she admitted. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "Neither have I," he said, which surprised her. "I mean, I was married before, but it was different. We courted first, had time to get to know each other. This is—" He paused, searching for words. "This is new territory for both of us." The admission helped somehow. Knowing that he didn't have all the answers, that he was figuring this out, just as much as she was, made him seem less intimidating and more human. "Will you tell me about her?" Abigail asked. "Your first wife." Silas was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old grief. "Her name was Mary. We met in town. She was the schoolteacher, sweet girl, gentle nature. She wanted to try life in the mountains, thought it would be an adventure." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. "She died giving birth to our daughter. The baby lived 3 days. Neither one of them was strong enough for this kind of life." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Abigail felt something shift in her understanding of him. This wasn't a man who viewed women as disposable or interchangeable. He was someone who'd loved and lost, who carried the weight of that loss in everything he did. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "That's why I need someone who already knows what these mountains demand," he continued, turning back to face her. "Someone who's proven they can survive out here. I can't go through that again, watching someone I'm responsible for suffer because they weren't prepared for this life. The honesty in his words hit her like a revelation. His proposition hadn't been about using her or treating her as property. It had been about finding someone who could survive what had killed his first family. In his mind, choosing her was as much about protecting her as it was about getting what he needed. "I understand," she said. And for the first time since this all began, she truly did. When he returned to sit beside her, the space between them felt different. Still uncertain, still awkward, but no longer hostile or frightening. They were two people who'd made a practical decision in impossible circumstances, and they were going to have to figure out how to make it work. "We don't have to do anything tonight," Silas said quietly. "You've had enough changes for one day. We can take time to get used to this." The offer surprised her. She'd expected him to claim his rights as her husband immediately, to treat their arrangement like any other transaction to be completed. Instead, he was giving her space to adjust, to find her footing in this new reality. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than he could know. They talked quietly for another hour, sharing small details about their lives and their histories. She learned that he could read well enough to enjoy books, that he'd taught himself to cook better than most women she knew, and that he'd built most of the furniture in the cabin with his own hands. He learned that she'd helped her father with trapping before he died, that she could shoot well enough to bring down small game, and that she'd kept her family's cabin running on her own for 2 years. When they finally settled down to sleep, Silas made a bed for himself on the floor with blankets and a pillow, leaving her the privacy of the actual bed. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. He was keeping his word about treating her with respect, about making this arrangement bearable for both of them. As Abigail lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his breathing and the settling of the cabin around them, she realized that her old life had truly ended. Tomorrow she would wake up as Mrs. Silas McGraw, bound to a man she barely knew by law and necessity. But for the first time since he'd made his shocking proposition, she didn't feel afraid. She felt something that might, with time and patience, grow into something more than mere survival. Whether that something would be contentment, partnership, or even affection remained to be seen. But lying there in the warm, secure cabin while the October wind howled outside, she allowed herself to hope that she'd made the right choice. The marriage certificate on the kitchen table bore witness to the death of her old self and the birth of someone new, someone who would have to learn to build a life from the most unlikely of beginnings. Abigail's sewing kit sat open on the kitchen table, her mother's silver needles catching the morning light that streamed through the cabin's eastern window. The familiar weight of the thimble on her finger and the rhythm of mending Silas's torn shirt brought her a measure of comfort in her first week as his wife. It was one of the few tasks that felt natural in this new life, one where her hands knew what to do without her mind having to navigate the complex waters of her changed circumstances. "You don't have to mend that," Silas said from where he sat sharpening his hunting knife near the fireplace. "It's old anyway. It's perfectly good fabric," she replied, not looking up from her work. "My mother always said waste was a sin when others had so little." She heard him pause in his sharpening, the rhythmic scrape of whetstone against blade falling silent. "Your mother sounds like she was a practical woman." She had to be. Abigail tied off the thread and examined her handiwork. The tear was nearly invisible now, the careful stitches blending seamlessly with the original weave. Life out here doesn't allow for anything else. It was true, though the practicality she'd learned at her mother's side felt different here in Silas's cabin. At home, she'd mended clothes because they couldn't afford to replace them. Here, she mended them because it felt like building something, taking care of the man who'd taken her in, creating order and comfort in their shared space. The past week had been a careful dance of learning each other's rhythms and routines. Silas rose before dawn, checking his traps and hunting lines while she prepared breakfast. He'd return with whatever game he'd caught, and she'd help him process it, her skills with a skinning knife proving more useful than either of them had expected. Afternoons were spent on the endless tasks of mountain living, chopping wood, repairing equipment, preparing for the harsh winter that loomed closer each day. "I'll be checking the upper traps today," Silas said, setting his knife aside and testing the edge with his thumb. "Should be back before dark, but there's a storm coming in. If I'm not back by sunset, don't come looking. These mountains can kill you if you get caught out in bad weather." The casual way he mentioned the possibility of death reminded Abigail that she was still learning to live in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Back in town, before her family had moved to their remote homestead, the biggest danger had been gossip or a bad crop year. Here, each day brought risks that could end everything. "What should I do if you don't come back?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "You know how to use a rifle?" "My father taught me to shoot." "Good. There's a loaded gun above the fireplace and another by the bed. You've got enough food for 2 weeks if you're careful. If something happens to me, wait out the storm, then head for town. Don't try to survive the winter alone." The matter-of-fact way he discussed his potential death unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. In the week since their marriage, she'd grown accustomed to his steady presence, his quiet competence in managing their daily survival. The thought of being alone again, of losing this fragile security she'd only just found, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. "Nothing's going to happen," Silas added, apparently reading something in her expression. "I've been working these mountains for years, but it's important you know what to do if it does." That afternoon, after he'd left for the upper traps, Abigail found herself restless in the empty cabin. She'd finished the mending, prepared vegetables for their evening meal, and organized the small collection of books on Silas's shelves. With nothing immediate demanding her attention, she was left alone with her thoughts for the first time since arriving. The loneliness surprised her. She'd expected to feel relief at having a few hours to herself, time to process everything that had changed in her life. Instead, she found herself listening for his footsteps, looking out the window for signs of his return. Somewhere in the past week, his presence had become not just tolerable, but comforting. She understood now why he'd chosen this arrangement over courting a woman from town. Any woman with other options would struggle with the isolation, the constant awareness of danger, the way survival took precedence over comfort or convenience. But for Abigail, who'd been alone for 2 years, having someone to share the burden felt like a gift rather than a sacrifice. The storm Silas had predicted arrived, earlier than expected, bringing with it wind that howled around the cabin and rain that turned quickly to sleet. Abigail kept the fire burning high and prepared hot food, knowing he'd be cold and hungry when he returned. As the afternoon stretched toward evening with no sign of him, she fought the urge to pace or peer anxiously out the window. When the door finally opened, just before full darkness, she felt a rush of relief so strong it left her momentarily light-headed. Silas stumbled in with ice in his beard and his clothes soaked through, carrying a string of rabbits and looking like he'd fought the storm every step of the way home. "Bad one," he said, hanging his coat on its peg and moving immediately toward the fire. "Came up faster than I expected." Abigail was already moving, pouring hot coffee and setting out dry clothes. "I was worried," she admitted, then immediately regretted the words. They implied a level of caring that might make him uncomfortable. Instead of brushing off her concern, he paused in toweling his hair dry and looked at her with something like gratitude. "It's been a long time since anyone worried about whether I made it home safe." The admission hung in the air between them, creating a moment of unexpected intimacy. For the first time since their wedding, Abigail glimpsed the loneliness that had driven him to seek a wife in such an unconventional way. This strong, capable man who seemed so self-sufficient had been living for years without anyone to share his worries or celebrate his safe returns. "Well, now you do," she said simply, handing him the hot coffee. As they shared their evening meal, with the storm raging outside and the cabin warm and secure around them, Abigail realized that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer strangers bound by necessity. They were partners, two people learning to depend on each other in the most basic ways possible. Her mother's sewing kit, with its worn needles and careful organization, sat closed on the table beside them, a symbol of the feminine touch she was bringing to his previously solitary life and of her own determination to build something lasting from the most practical of beginnings. The hand-carved wooden doll lay hidden beneath a pile of old blankets in the back corner of the storage room, but Abigail's exploring fingers found it while searching for extra quilts to prepare for winter. The moment her hands closed around the smooth wood, she knew she'd discovered something precious and private. The craftsmanship was exquisite, tiny features carved with painstaking detail, a miniature dress painted in soft blues and whites, even small wooden shoes that could be removed from equally small feet. This wasn't the rough work of a man whittling to pass time. This was art, created with love and infinite patience by someone who'd wanted to make something perfect for a child. "What are you doing back there?" Silas's voice from the main room made her start, nearly dropping the doll. "Looking for extra bedding," she called back, her voice catching slightly. She set the doll carefully back where she'd found it and pulled out several quilts, but the image of that tiny, perfect face stayed with her. At dinner that evening, she found herself studying Silas's hands as he cut his meat and buttered his bread. They were large, weathered hands marked by years of hard work, but she could see now the careful precision in his movements, the way he handled even mundane tasks with a craftsman's attention to detail. "Silas," she said carefully, "how long were you married before?" He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and she saw his shoulders tense. 3 years. "And your daughter? How long did she live?" The fork clinked against his plate as he set it down. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat into the careful silence he sometimes wrapped around himself when difficult subjects arose. 4 days, he said finally. Mary was in labor for nearly 2 days. The baby was born. Too early, too small. We knew she probably wouldn't make it, but for 4 days we hoped. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Abigail felt her heart clench with sympathy. What was her name? Rose. The word came out barely above a whisper. We were going to call her Rose. I found the doll, Abigail said gently. The one you made for her. Silas went completely still, his hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on his plate. You shouldn't have been going through my things. I wasn't. I was looking for quilts, and it was just there. She reached across the table and touched his hand, surprised by her own boldness. It's beautiful, Silas. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I worked on it the whole time Mary was carrying her. Thought if I could make something perfect enough, maybe it would keep her safe somehow. Foolish thinking. It's not foolish to want to protect the people you love. Love. He said the word like it tasted bitter. Love doesn't stop babies from dying, Abigail. Doesn't stop women from bleeding to death in childbirth. Sometimes I think love just makes the losing hurt worse. The raw honesty in his words took her breath away. This was why he'd approached marriage like a business arrangement, why he'd been so careful to frame their relationship in practical terms. He was protecting himself from the devastating loss he'd already endured once. Maybe, she said carefully, but it also makes the living sweeter. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, but something had changed between them. Abigail had seen past his careful defenses to the grief he carried, and he had trusted her with the memory of his lost daughter. When Silas cut his hand badly the next day while skinning a deer, her response came from instinct rather than obligation. Let me see, she said, taking his wounded hand in both of hers and examining the deep gash across his palm. Blood was seeping steadily from the cut, and she could see it would need careful tending to heal properly. It's fine, he said, trying to pull away. Just a scratch. It's not fine, and you know it. Her voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. Sit, Down and let me clean it properly." She worked with steady hands, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made him hiss through his teeth, then binding it with strips of clean cloth from her own petticoat. Her fingers were gentle but sure as she wrapped the bandage, and she could feel the way he watched her face while she worked. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My mother. She tended anyone who needed it in our settlement, said healing was women's work just as much as birthing." She tied off the bandage and looked up to find his eyes fixed on hers. "There. Keep it clean and dry, and it should heal without trouble. Thank you." The words carried more weight than a simple expression of gratitude. In his voice she heard recognition, acknowledgement that she was proving herself capable of caring for him in ways that went beyond their practical arrangement. That night, as they prepared for bed, Silas spoke quietly from where he sat, removing his boots. "I want you to know something, Abigail. What we have here, it's not the same as what I had with Mary, but that doesn't mean it's worth less." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He was telling her that he valued what they were building together, even if it had grown from necessity rather than romance. "I know," she said, and meant it. What they had was different, steadier in some ways, built on mutual respect and shared challenges rather than passion, but it was real, and it was theirs. 2 weeks later, she realized she'd missed her monthly cycle. The knowledge brought with it a mixture of fear and hope that left her dizzy with possibility. She was 20 years old, married to a man who needed sons, living in a place where children were both a blessing and a risk. The memory of little Rose, who'd lived only 4 days, made her hand tremble as she pressed it to her still flat belly. When she told Silas that evening, his reaction was carefully controlled, but she could see the hope he was trying to hide behind practical concern. "We'll take good care of you," he said, his hand covering hers where it rested on her stomach. "Both of you." For the first time since their wedding, Abigail allowed herself to believe that what they had might be enough. Not just for survival, but for something approaching happiness. The letter arrived on a grey November morning, carried by a mail rider who'd made the dangerous journey into the mountains despite the early snow. Abigail recognized the careful script on the envelope immediately, her Aunt Margaret's handwriting, precise and proper as everything else about her father's sister. "Letter for you," Silas said, handing her the envelope with a neutral expression that didn't quite hide his curiosity. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. She'd written to her aunt weeks ago before her marriage, telling her about her parents' deaths and her precarious situation. This response had taken so long to arrive that she'd assumed it had been lost, or that Margaret had chosen not to reply. "My dear niece," the letter began in her aunt's familiar formal tone. "I was grieved to learn of Thomas and Sarah's passing, and horrified to discover that you have been left alone in that wilderness for so long. Your uncle and I have discussed your situation at length, and we are prepared to offer you a home here in St. Louis. James has connections in several respectable households where a young woman of good character might find employment as a governess or companion. The position would provide room, board, and a modest income, along with the opportunity to live among civilized people once again. We understand that you may have formed attachments to your current situation, but surely you must see that a young woman of 20 has no business attempting to survive alone in such conditions. Your dear mother would be appalled to know what hardships you have endured. Please reply at your earliest convenience. If you are agreeable, we will arrange for escort to bring you safely to St. Louis before the worst of winter sets in. Consider this our Christian duty to family, and do not let pride prevent you from accepting help when it is so freely offered. Your devoted aunt, Margaret Wellington. Abigail read the letter twice, then set it carefully on the table. The offer was generous, more generous than she'd had any right to expect. A chance to return to civilization, to live comfortably among educated people, to have security without the constant threat of wolves or harsh weather or the dozen other dangers that defined mountain life. "Good news?" Silas asked, though his tone suggested he suspected otherwise. "My aunt. She's offering me a home in St. Louis." Abigail folded the letter precisely along its original creases. "A position as a governess, room and board provided." Silas went very still, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. When he set it down, she could hear the slight clink of ceramic against wood in the sudden silence. "That's generous of her," he said finally. "Yes, it is. When would you leave?" The question hung between them like a blade. Abigail looked at his face, noting the careful way he was holding his expression neutral, and realized that he expected her to go. Of course he did. What woman, given the choice between a comfortable life in the city and the harsh reality of frontier existence, would choose to stay? "She wants an answer as soon as possible," Abigail said, not directly addressing his question. "Before winter makes travel impossible." Silas nodded once, then stood abruptly from the table. "I should check the snares. Storm's moving in, and they'll need to be cleared before it hits." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone, with the letter and the weight of the choice it represented. Through the window, she could see him moving with purposeful efficiency through his morning routine. But there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The truth was, she hadn't considered leaving. Not seriously. In the weeks since their marriage, the mountain cabin had become home in ways her childhood house had never been. Here, she was needed. Her skills mattered. Her presence made a difference in their daily survival. In St. Louis, she would be dependent on charity, grateful for whatever position she could find, always conscious of being the poor relation who'd needed rescuing. But there was more to it than that, and she was honest enough to admit it. The thought of leaving Silas caused an actual ache in her chest. Somewhere in the careful dance of their developing partnership, she'd grown attached to him, not just as a provider or protector, but as a person. She'd come to treasure their quiet conversations by the fire, the way he listened when she spoke, the gentle consideration he showed her despite their unconventional beginning. And then there was the baby. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the first signs of pregnancy were just beginning to show. How could she explain to her respectable aunt that she was carrying a child conceived in a marriage based on necessity rather than love? How could she raise that child in a world that would judge both its origins and its mother? When Silas returned from checking his snares, snow was beginning to fall in earnest. He stamped his feet on the porch and shook the flakes from his coat before coming inside, bringing with him the sharp scent of winter air. "Find anything?" Abigail asked, grateful for the mundane question. "2 rabbits. Should make a good stew." He hung his coat on its peg and warmed his hands by the fire. "Letter still bothering you?" "She's not wrong, you know," Abigail said suddenly. "About this being no life for a young woman. About my mother being appalled by what I've endured." Silas turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Is that what you think? That you're enduring this life?" The question surprised her with its directness. No, that's not what I meant. Because if you are, if you're here because you feel trapped or obligated, then maybe you should consider her offer. No one should have to endure marriage." There was something in his voice, a carefully controlled pain that made her look at him more closely. He was trying to give her permission to leave, she realized, trying to make it easier for her to choose the comfortable life in St. Louis over the uncertain future they were building together. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked quietly, his hands stilled on the mantel where he'd been resting them. "What? What if I want to stay here, with you, even though you could? Have a better life elsewhere? Better according to whom?" Abigail stood and moved to where he waited by the fire. "Silas, in the past 2 months, I've learned to process game, to read weather signs, to tend wounds and manage a household that actually functions. I've discovered I'm stronger than I thought I was. How is depending on charity in a city where I know no one better than building something real here? And the baby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our baby deserves to grow up knowing both parents, knowing where it came from, not wondering why its mother ran away from its father." She saw something shift in his expression, a careful hope replacing the resignation that had been there since she'd read the letter aloud. "You're sure?" Instead of answering with words, Abigail stepped closer and took his hands in hers. They were warm from the fire, calloused from work, steady and strong. These were hands that could build a cradle, teach a child to hunt, protect a family from whatever dangers the mountains might bring. "I'm sure," she said. Silas's father's compass lay open in his palm, its brass surface tarnished with age, but the needle still pointing true north with unwavering certainty. He studied it in the lamplight while Abigail worked on her mending nearby, the familiar weight of the instrument grounding him in memories of the man who taught him to read the mountain's moods and navigate by star and stone. "Your father was a mountain man too?" Abigail asked, noticing his contemplation of the compass. "Among other things." Silas closed the compass carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. "He was a surveyor for the railroad, back when they were first pushing west. Spent months at a time in country that had never seen a white man. This compass kept him alive more times than he could count, and he passed it on to you, along with everything he knew about reading the land, following water, finding shelter." Silas settled back in his chair, his voice taking on the reflective quality it held when he spoke of his past. "He always said a man without direction was just waiting to die, but a man who knew where he was going could survive anything." The irony wasn't lost on him. For months now, since the first time he'd seen Abigail struggling to survive alone in her cabin, his own sense of direction had been shifting. The careful, solitary life he'd built after Mary's death had been disrupted by this young woman who'd proven stronger and more adaptable than he'd ever expected. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" Abigail asked suddenly, setting down her sewing. "Building a life together the way we have." Her pregnancy was showing now, a gentle curve that made her dresses fit differently and brought a glow to her skin that caught his attention at unexpected moments. She was 4 months along, healthy and strong, but he'd noticed the way she sometimes pressed her hand to her belly with a mixture of wonder and worry. "What do you mean?" "Most people marry for love, or at least affection. We married for survival." She smoothed her skirt over her knees, a gesture he'd come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "Sometimes I wonder if we're cheating our child. Somehow bringing them into a family that started with necessity instead of feeling." Silas considered her words carefully. It was a question he'd wrestled with himself, particularly on the long nights when he lay listening to her quiet breathing and trying to understand what had developed between them. "My parents married for love," he said finally, passionate, all-consuming. Love that made them willing to risk everything for each other. And I watched my father nearly destroy himself when she died. He loved her so much that losing her broke something in him that never healed. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow that had been falling steadily for 3 days. "Maybe there's something to be said for a foundation built on respect and partnership instead of just feeling. Do you think that's what we have? Respect and partnership?" He turned to study her face in the firelight, noting the way the flames brought out the gold in her brown hair and cast shadows across her features. Over the months, he'd grown familiar with every expression she wore, from the determined set of her jaw when she tackled a difficult task to the soft smile that appeared when she thought he wasn't watching. "I think we have something that's growing into whatever we let it become," he said honestly. The truth was more complicated than he was willing to admit aloud. What had started as a practical arrangement had evolved into something he wasn't sure how to name. He found himself thinking about her when he was out checking traps, hurrying home, not just because the weather was turning, but because he wanted to share the small discoveries of his day. He looked forward to their quiet conversations, to the way she listened to his stories and offered her own insights about the world they shared. "Silas," she said quietly, "when you look at me now, what do you see?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "What do you mean?" "When you made your proposition, you saw a woman who could survive mountain life, who could give you children and help with the work. When you look at me now, is that still all you see?" He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her, hands in his. They were no longer the soft hands of a town girl, but the capable hands of a woman who'd learned to skin game and split wood and tend a garden. There were small scars from kitchen knives and rope burns from hauling water, marks of a life lived with purpose. "When I look at you now," he said, surprised by the roughness in his own voice, "I see the woman who stayed awake all night when I had fever, who argued with me about the proper way to preserve meat because you had a better method than mine. I see someone who chose to stay here when she could have had an easier life elsewhere." He paused, searching for words to express feelings he hadn't expected to develop. "I see my wife, Abigail, not just the mother of my future children or a partner in survival, but my wife." The word carried weight it hadn't held when they'd first spoken their vows. Then it had been a legal formality, a necessary step in their practical arrangement. Now it felt like something more, a recognition of the bond that had grown between them through shared challenges and quiet moments of understanding. "I'm glad," she said simply, but he could see the relief in her eyes. That night, the fever struck. Without warning, Abigail woke to find Silas burning hot beside her, his breathing labored and his skin slick with sweat. By morning he was delirious, muttering about compass readings and calling for his father. The fever that had carried off her parents seemed to have found him, and for the first time since their marriage, Abigail faced the possibility of being truly alone again. She spent 3 days nursing him, cooling his fever with wet cloths and forcing water between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She spoke to him constantly, telling him about the baby, about their plans for spring, about anything that might anchor him to consciousness and give him reason to fight. On the 4th night, when his fever finally broke, she was sitting beside the bed, with his father's compass in her hands, trying to understand how it worked in case she needed to find her way to town for help. "North is that way," he said weakly, his voice little more than a whisper. "Silas." She set the compass aside and pressed her hand to his forehead, finding it cool and damp instead of burning. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a bull." He tried to sit up and thought better of it. "How long?" 4 days. I thought." Her voice broke, and she had to take a breath before continuing. "I thought I was going to lose you. Takes more than a fever to kill an old mountain goat like me." But his hand found hers and squeezed gently. "Thank you for taking care of me." "That's what wives do," she said, and meant it in ways she couldn't have imagined when they'd first spoken those words. As he recovered over the following weeks, their relationship shifted again. The crisis had stripped away the last of their careful politeness, leaving behind something more honest and immediate. She'd seen him vulnerable and helpless, and he'd trusted her completely with his life. They'd both learned what it meant to face the possibility of loss, and the knowledge changed how they moved through their daily routines. "I want to write to your aunt," Silas said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Tell her you've decided to stay, that you're settled and happy here." "Are you happy?" Abigail asked. "Really?" He considered the question seriously, his gaze moving from her face to her rounded belly and back again. "I didn't think I would be. When I lost Mary and Rose, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people. But this, what we're building here, it feels right in a way I didn't expect. Even though it's not what either of us planned, especially because it's not what we planned." He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. Sometimes the best things are the ones you never thought to ask for. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, but inside their small circle of warmth and light, Abigail felt a contentment she'd never known was possible. The compass in Silas's pocket might point unfailingly north, but their own direction had been found through trust, patience, and the kind of love that grew slowly and surely from the most practical of beginnings. The wanted poster was weathered and torn at the edges, but Silas McGraw's name was still clearly visible in bold black letters across the top. Abigail stared at it in shock, her hands trembling as she read the charges. Wanted for murder, 500 reward. Silas McGraw, wanted for the killing of Jeremiah Stone in Copper Falls, Montana Territory. The bounty hunter who'd handed it to her was a lean man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to his vest. He'd introduced himself as Clayton Morse, claiming to represent the Territorial Marshal's office, and he'd arrived at their cabin while Silas was out checking his trap lines. "That's your husband, isn't it?" Morse asked, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man accustomed to having his questions answered. "Silas McGraw, mountain man, married to a young woman named Abigail just a few months back?" Yes, but this has to be a mistake." Abigail forced herself to meet his gaze, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Silas wouldn't hurt anyone. He's not a violent man. According to witnesses in Copper Falls, he shot Jeremiah Stone in cold blood over a disputed mining claim. Stone was unarmed, begging for his life. Morse pulled out a small notebook and consulted it with theatrical precision. 3 witnesses saw the whole thing. McGraw fled town that same night and hasn't been seen since. That was 8 years ago. 8 years. The timeline fit perfectly with when Silas had appeared in these mountains, claiming a homestead far from any settlement. Abigail's mind raced, trying to reconcile the gentle man who'd carved a doll for his lost daughter with the cold-blooded killer described in the poster. "There has to be some explanation," she said, but her voice sounded weak, even to her own ears. "Maybe. There is. That's why I'm here to bring him in for trial, instead of collecting the bounty the hard way." Morse folded the poster and slipped it back into his coat. "Where is he now, Mrs. McGraw?" "Checking his traps. He'll be back before dark." "Good. I'll wait." Morse settled himself in one of their chairs without invitation, his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol. "Comfortable little place you have here. Must be nice, living so far from civilization where a man's past doesn't catch up with him." The hours that followed were the longest of Abigail's life. She went through the motions of preparing dinner while Morse watched her every move, making casual conversation that felt like veiled threats. He asked about their marriage, about how long she'd known Silas, about whether she'd ever suspected her husband might be a wanted man. "Sometimes women know," he said conversationally as she stirred the stew. "They pick up on little things, the way a man startles at unexpected sounds, how he watches the horizon like he's expecting trouble. A guilty conscience leaves marks if you know how to look for them." Abigail thought about all the times she'd noticed Silas's careful vigilance, the way he always seemed aware of his surroundings, his reluctance to talk about his past before coming to the mountains. She'd attributed it to the natural caution of a man living in dangerous country, but now those memories took on a different cast. When Silas finally appeared in the doorway at sunset, his reaction to finding a stranger in his cabin confirmed Abigail's worst fears. For just a moment his face went completely blank, the careful mask of a man caught in a situation he'd hoped never to face. Then his eyes found the badge on Morse's vest, and she saw resignation settle over his features like a shroud. "Mr. McGraw," Morse said, rising slowly from his chair, "I think you know why I'm here." "I do." Silas set down his rifle with deliberate care and raised his hand slightly, showing he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "Just let me say goodbye to my wife." "Silas." "No." Abigail stepped between them, her pregnancy making her movements awkward, but her voice fierce with determination. "Tell him it's not true. Tell him you didn't kill anyone, Abigail. Tell him." The words came out as a near shout, surprising all 3 of them with their intensity. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something break in his expression. "I can't tell him that." The admission hit her like a physical blow. She'd been prepared for denials, for explanations, for anything except this quiet acceptance of guilt. "What do you mean you can't?" "Because I did kill Jeremiah Stone." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the same tone he used to discuss the weather or the need to chop more firewood. "Not the way they say it happened, But I did kill him. Morse stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs, but Silas held up a hand. "Give me a minute to explain to my wife. She deserves to know the truth." "Make it quick." Silas turned to Abigail, his eyes holding a pain she'd never seen there before. "Stone wasn't just after my mining claim. He'd been running a brothel using girls he'd kidnapped from settlements throughout the territory. Some of them weren't more than children." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face as she began to understand. "I'd been tracking him for weeks after he took a girl from a family I knew, found his camp, found the girls he was holding." Silas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I tried to arrest him legal-like, but he went for his gun. In the fight, one of the girls got shot. She was maybe 15 years old, and she died because I couldn't stop him fast enough." "So you killed him?" "I executed him." The distinction seemed important to Silas. "Shot him while he was trying to reload. The witnesses who saw it happen were his men. They weren't about to tell anyone about the girls or what Stone had been doing to them." Morse listened to this recitation with obvious skepticism. "Convenient story, McGraw. Too bad you can't prove any of it." "Actually," Silas said quietly, "I can." He moved slowly to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, keeping his hands visible as he opened it and withdrew a bundle of papers. Letters from the families of the girls he took. Testimony from the ones I was able to save. Even a confession. Stone wrote before he died, thinking it might save his life. Morse examined the documents with growing surprise, his confidence wavering as he read account after account of Stone's crimes. "Why didn't you present this evidence 8 years ago?" "Because I was 26 years old and scared out of my mind." Stone's men were already spreading their version of what happened, and I knew no one would believe a drifter's word against 3 upstanding citizens of Copper Falls. Silas's laugh was bitter. "So I ran. Figured it was better to disappear than hang for doing the right thing." Abigail felt her legs give way, and she sank into a chair as the full weight of what she'd learned settled over her. Her husband wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but he was still a wanted man. Even if Morse believed his story, even if the evidence cleared his name, their life together was about to be destroyed. "I have to take you in," Morse said finally. "Let a judge sort this out." "I know." Silas looked at Abigail, his expression full of regret. "I'm sorry. I should have told you before we married. You had a right to know what you were getting into." "Would it have changed anything?" she asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "I don't know. I hoped it would never matter, that the past would stay buried." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "But I want you to know, everything between us has been real. Whatever else I am, what we built together was honest." Before she could respond, he was on his feet again, holding out his hands for Morse's handcuffs. "We can leave at first light. The trail's too dangerous to travel in the dark. And my wife needs time to prepare." As the iron shackles clicked closed around Silas's wrists, Abigail realized that everything she'd believed about her life was about to change again. But this time, she wasn't facing the uncertainty alone. This time, she had something worth fighting for. Abigail's father's rifle felt heavier than she remembered as she lifted it from its place above the fireplace. The weapon had been her father's pride, a precision instrument he'd used to keep his family fed during their years on the frontier. Now, hidden beneath loose floorboards while Morse dozed in his chair, she checked its load and prayed she'd inherited more than just her father's steady hands. "What are you planning?" Silas whispered from where he sat shackled to the heavy wooden chair Morse had positioned near the fireplace. "Getting you out of this," she whispered back, her voice barely audible over the bounty hunter's steady breathing. "Abigail, no. You'll only make things worse for yourself. For the baby." She paused, in her preparations to meet his eyes. In the dim light from the dying fire, she could see the concern etched across his features, not for himself, but for her and their unborn child. Even now, facing capture and possible execution, his first thought was protecting his family. "Do you remember what you told me about your father's compass?" she asked quietly. About how a man without direction is just waiting to die. This is different. You can't fight the law. I'm not fighting the law. I'm fighting for the truth. She moved closer, kneeling beside his chair so she could keep her voice low. Morse doesn't want justice, Silas. He wants that reward money. He'll drag you back to Copper Falls and let Stone's men finish what they started 8 years ago. Even if that's true, running will only make me look more guilty. Then we don't run. Abigail placed her hand over her belly, where their child was growing strong despite the chaos surrounding them. We make them come to us on our terms, in country we know better than they do. Before Silas could respond, a sharp pain shot through her lower back, so intense it left her gasping. The stress of the past day, combined with the physical strain of preparing for a confrontation, was taking its toll on her pregnancy. "What's wrong?" Silas's voice was tight with alarm. "Nothing. Just another pain, stronger this time, radiating from her back to her belly." "Oh, God!" Morse stirred in his chair, his eyes opening to focus on the scene before him. "What's happening?" "The baby," Abigail managed between gritted teeth. "Something's wrong with the baby." The bounty hunter was on his feet immediately, his hand moving to his weapon as he assessed the situation. "Is this some kind of trick? Does she look like she's pretending?" Silas strained against his shackles, desperation clear in his voice. "Let me help her. Please. Stay where you are." Morse approached cautiously, studying Abigail's face in the firelight. Her skin had gone pale, and she was breathing in short, sharp gasps as another contraction gripped her. "How far along are you?" "6 months," she whispered. "Too early." "It's too early." The fear in her voice was genuine, and Morse seemed to recognize it. Whatever his faults, he wasn't heartless enough to let a woman suffer in childbirth while he stood by and watched. "All right," he said finally. "I'll unlock him so he can help you, but if either of you tries anything—" "We won't," Silas said quickly. "Just let me get her to the bed." Morse freed Silas from his shackles but kept his gun drawn as Silas helped Abigail to their bedroom. The contractions were coming stronger now, and she could feel wetness between her legs that might have been blood or birth fluid. She couldn't tell which in the darkness. "Talk to me," Silas said as he helped her lie down. "How bad is the pain?" "Bad, but not." She paused as another contraction hit. "Not like it's time yet. Something's wrong." From the main room they could hear Morse pacing, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he'd found himself in. He'd come here to collect a bounty, not to deliver a baby in a remote mountain cabin. "Listen to me," Silas said quietly. His voice meant for her ears alone. "Whatever happens tonight, you need to know that you and this baby are the best things that ever happened to me. If something goes wrong, nothing's going wrong." Abigail gripped his hand with surprising strength. "We're all getting through this together." But even as she said the words, she could feel her body rebelling against the stress and fear of the past day. The baby wasn't ready to be born, but her body seemed to be trying to expel it anyway. She'd heard stories of women who lost their children to early labor brought on by shock or trauma, and the possibility terrified her more than any bounty hunter ever could. "We need help," she said suddenly. "Real help. There's a woman in the next valley, Mrs. Patterson. She's helped with difficult births before." "That's 2 hours' ride in good weather," Silas pointed out, "and there's a storm moving in." As if summoned by his words, wind began to howl around the cabin, carrying with it the first flakes of what promised to be a significant snowfall. Through the window, they could see the weather deteriorating rapidly, the kind of sudden mountain storm that could trap travelers for days. "We can't stay here," Abigail said, another contraction forcing the words out between gasps. "If the baby comes too early, if there are complications—" "I know." Silas looked toward the main room where Morse was still pacing. "Let me talk to him." When Silas returned to the main room, he found the bounty hunter standing by the window, watching the storm gather strength. "How is she?" "Not good. The baby's trying to come too early. Without proper help, we could lose them both." Morse turned to face him, and for the first time since arriving, his expression showed genuine concern rather than professional calculation. "What do you need?" "Safe passage to get her to someone who knows about difficult births. There's a woman in the next valley who's helped with situations like this before. In this weather, we'd never make it. We have to try." Silas met the bounty hunter's eyes steadily. "I know you have a job to do, but she's innocent in all this. The baby's innocent. Whatever you think of me, they don't deserve to die because of my past." Morse was quiet for a long moment, studying Silas's face. "You really love her, don't you? This isn't just about the arrangement you made. She's my wife, my family. Whatever else I am, I won't let them suffer for my mistakes." From the bedroom came a cry of pain that cut through both men like a knife. When Silas started toward the sound, Morse made no move to stop him. "Go," the bounty hunter said quietly. "Help your wife." Abigail was gripping the bedpost when Silas reached her, her knuckles white with effort as she rode out another contraction. "It's getting worse," she said when she could speak again. "And the bleeding, there's definitely bleeding now." Silas felt cold fear settle in his stomach. He'd lost one wife to childbirth complications, and the thought of losing Abigail the same way was more than he could bear. But she was stronger than Mary had been, more resilient, and this wasn't her first crisis. She'd survived alone in the mountains for 2 years. She could survive this too. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Help me sit up. Walking might slow the contractions." She leaned on him as she struggled to her feet, then paused as another wave of pain hit. "And Silas, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. If something does," she continued firmly, "promise me you'll tell our child the truth about why we married. Not that it was just necessity, but that it became something real, something worth fighting for." "I promise," he said, though the words felt like an admission of defeat. As they slowly made their way back to the main room, they found Morse loading supplies into his saddlebags with grim efficiency. "I've been thinking," he said without looking up, "that reward money isn't worth much if I freeze to death collecting it. Maybe we should all try to make it to this Mrs. Patterson's place." "You'd risk the storm?" Silas asked, surprised by the offer. "I've been in worse weather." Morse straightened, slinging his bags over his shoulder. "Besides, I've got a wife back in Denver. If she were in trouble, I'd want someone to help her, even if that someone was a wanted man." Outside, the wind was howling like a living thing, and snow was falling so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. But they had no choice. With Abigail's labor progressing rapidly and no other help available, their only option was to brave the storm and hope they could reach safety before it was too late. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been their sanctuary, Abigail pressed her hand to her belly one more time. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, she was determined that her child would have a chance at life, and that the man she'd learned to love would be there to help raise it. The baby's first blanket lay spread across Abigail's lap as she worked. The shuttle through the loom, her swollen fingers moving with practiced precision, despite the pain that shot through her back with each contraction. She'd started weaving it months ago, during the long winter evenings, when Silas would read aloud by the fire, choosing soft wool she'd traded for in town and dyeing it with berries she'd gathered herself. The pattern was simple but beautiful, alternating. Bands of cream and pale blue that would wrap around her child like a piece of captured sky. "We should have made for Mrs. Patterson's place hours ago," Morse said from where he stood guard at the window, watching the blizzard rage outside with increasing concern. "This storm's only getting worse." "Can't travel in this," Silas replied, his voice tight with worry as he watched Abigail struggle through another contraction. "We'd lose the trail before we made it a mile. Better to wait it out and hope." His words were cut off by Abigail's sharp cry of pain. This contraction was different, stronger, and longer than the others, and when it passed, she was left gasping and pale. "The baby's coming," she said simply. Now, Silas felt the bottom drop out of his world. He'd delivered foals and calves, but never a human child, and certainly never one arriving 2 months early in the middle of a blizzard with no help available. Every instinct told him this was beyond his abilities, but there was no one else. "Tell me what to do," he said, moving to kneel beside the bed where she'd managed to position herself. "Hot water," she gasped. "Clean cloths, and that blanket. I want it ready for when the baby comes." Morse had abandoned his post at the window and was stoking the fire, adding wood with the focused intensity of a man trying to be useful in a situation completely outside his experience. "How long does this usually take?" "Could be hours," Silas said, though privately he feared it might be much faster than that. Abigail's labor had been progressing rapidly since the contractions began, and early babies often came quickly once. The process started. "Silas!" Abigail's voice was strained but determined. "I need you to listen carefully. If something goes wrong, if you have to choose between me and the baby, that's not going to happen. If you do," she continued, gripping his hand with surprising strength, "choose the baby. Our child deserves a chance. Don't talk like that." His voice was rough with emotion. "You're both going to be fine." But even as he said the words, he could see the blood soaking through the bedding beneath her. Too much blood coming too fast. His mind flashed back to Mary's final hours, to the helpless feeling of watching life slip away, despite everything he tried to do to stop it. Another contraction hit, and this time, Abigail couldn't suppress a scream. When it passed, she was panting heavily, her skin pale and damp with sweat despite the cold. "I can see the head," Silas said, wonder and terror warring in his voice. "The baby's coming." What followed was the longest and most intense hour of his life. With Morse providing hot water and clean cloths, and Abigail drawing on reserves of strength he hadn't known she possessed, their son came into the world during the worst blizzard in memory. He was small, impossibly small, but his cries were strong and angry, filling the cabin with the sound of new life. "Is he all right?" Abigail asked weakly, as Silas wrapped the tiny body in the blanket she'd woven. "He's perfect," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed their son in her arms. "Small, but perfect." The baby's cries gradually settled to soft whimpers as he found the warmth of his mother's body. Despite his early arrival, he seemed alert and responsive, his tiny fingers grasping at the blanket that surrounded him, but their moment of relief was short-lived. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, with wind that shook the cabin's walls and snow falling so thick it was impossible to see anything beyond the windows. And from somewhere in the distance came a sound that made all three adults freeze, the baying of hounds, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakably getting closer. "Company," Morse said grimly, checking his weapons. "Sounds like more bounty. Hunters, and they brought tracking dogs." Silas felt his blood turn to ice. Stone's men had finally found him, drawn by rumors of Morse's success in tracking down the wanted mountain man, but they hadn't expected to find a newborn baby and a woman who'd just given birth. "How many?" he asked, moving to the window to peer out into the storm. "Hard to tell. At least 3 or 4 riders, maybe more." Morse's professional demeanor had returned, but there was grim determination in his voice. "They won't wait for better weather. They'll want to finish this tonight." As if to confirm his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats became audible even over the wind. Whoever was coming had pushed through the blizzard with single-minded determination, and they were almost at the cabin door. Abigail clutched their son closer to her chest, the baby's blanket the only barrier between him and a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than the storm raging outside. The sheriff's badge caught the firelight as Marshal Thomas Kane stepped through the cabin door, snow still clinging to his coat and ice forming in his graying beard. Behind him came 2 deputies, their hands resting on their weapons but not drawn, their eyes taking in the scene before them with professional assessment. "Well," Kane said, his weathered face showing surprise at finding a newborn baby and a woman in childbed. "This isn't quite what we expected to find, Marshal Kane," Morse said, stepping forward with obvious relief. "Wasn't expecting to see you out in this weather. Got word you'd tracked McGraw to this area. Figured I'd better come see for myself." Kane's eyes moved to Silas, who stood protectively near the bed where Abigail held their son. "You're a hard man to find, McGraw. I wasn't hiding from the law," Silas said carefully. "Just trying to build a life away from trouble. Trouble has a way of following a man, doesn't it?" Kane removed his hat and shook the snow from it, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, especially when that man's wanted for murder. "Marshal," Morse began, "there are some things you should know about this case. McGraw's got evidence that Jeremiah Stone was a kidnapper and a killer," Kane finished. "I know. Got a telegraph from the territorial governor 3 days ago. Seems a federal marshal down in Colorado finally caught up with Stone's old gang. Under pressure, they told a very different story about what happened in Copper Falls 8 years ago." The words hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Silas felt his knees nearly give way as the full import of Kane's statement sank in. "What are you saying?" Abigail asked from the bed, her voice weak but hopeful. "I'm saying your husband's been cleared of all charges," Kane replied. "The men who testified against him have confessed to lying. Turns out Stone was running a kidnapping operation, just like McGraw claimed. The federal marshals found evidence linking Stone to the disappearance of more than a dozen young women throughout the territory." Morse stared at the marshal in shock. "Then why are you here?" "To officially notify McGraw that the charges have been dropped and to apologize for the territory's failure to investigate his claims properly 8 years ago." Kane's expression was grim. "Unfortunately, we also learned that Stone's remaining associates put a private bounty on McGraw's head. They've been hunting him for years, trying to silence the one man who could expose their operation." "How many are still out there?" Silas asked. "3 that we know of. And according to our intelligence, they're all in this area, drawn by rumors. That Morse had found you," Kane gestured toward the door. "In fact, we passed their camp about 2 miles back. They're waiting out the storm, planning to move on you at first light." Abigail shifted their son in her arms, the baby stirring restlessly, at the tension in her voice. "What does this mean for us?" "It means you're free to live your lives without looking over your shoulders," Kane said. "Soon as we round up Stone's men anyway. But that's our job, not yours." One of the deputies had been quietly examining the documents Silas had shown Morse earlier. "Marshal, you should see these. Testimonies from the families of Stone's victims, even what looks like a deathbed confession." Kane studied the papers with growing interest. "McGraw, why didn't you present this evidence 8 years ago?" "I was young and scared. Stone's men had the sheriff in their pocket, and I knew no one would believe me over 3 upstanding citizens." Silas moved closer to Abigail, his hand coming to rest protectively on her shoulder. "So I ran. Can't say I blame you. Corruption was rampant in those days, especially in the mining towns." Kane folded the documents carefully and handed them back. "But these will go a long way toward clearing your name officially. The territorial government wants to make this right." "What? About the men who are still hunting him?" Abigail asked. "They won't just give up because you tell them to." "They will when they're in federal custody," Kane said grimly. "We've got warrants for all 3 of them. Murder, kidnapping, conspiracy. They'll be lucky if they don't hang." The marshal's confidence was reassuring, but Silas had lived with the threat for too long to relax completely. "How do you plan to take them? They're experienced men, and they know these mountains." "We use the storm to our advantage. They're holed up in a line shack about 2 miles from here, waiting for dawn. We'll surround them while they're still sleeping off whatever they drank to stay warm." "I want to come with you," Silas said suddenly. "Absolutely not," Abigail said before Kane could respond. "You have a newborn son and a wife who just gave birth. Your place is here." Kane nodded agreement. "She's right. You've done enough, McGraw. Time to let the law handle this." As dawn approached and the storm finally began to show signs of breaking, Kane and his men prepared to leave. Before going, the marshal turned back to address Silas directly. "There's one more thing," Kane said, his expression serious. "The territorial government wants to offer you compensation for the years you spent as a fugitive. It won't undo what happened, but it's an acknowledgement that justice failed you." "I don't need their money," Silas replied. "I just want to live in peace with my family. Even so, you've earned it. And with a new baby, you'll have expenses." Kane pulled on his gloves and adjusted his hat. "We'll be in touch once this business with Stone's men is finished." Morse, who had remained silent through most of this exchange, stepped forward. "Marshal, what about my contract with the Territorial Marshal's office? I was hired to bring McGraw in." "Consider it fulfilled. You found him, and now we can officially clear his name. The territory will honor your fee." As the lawmen rode out into the breaking dawn, Abigail watched from the cabin window, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. "I think," Silas said, settling beside her on the bed, "that we can finally stop looking over our shoulders and start looking ahead." The baby stirred in his blanket, making the soft sounds that newborns make when they're content and warm. For the first time in 8 years, Silas allowed himself to believe that his past wouldn't destroy his future. "What should we name him?" Abigail asked, studying their son's tiny features in the morning light. "I was thinking Thomas," Silas said. "After your father. Thomas McGraw." She tested the name, smiling at how it sounded. "I like it. Thomas McGraw, born free." Outside, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and the promise of new beginnings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer as strangers bound by necessity, but as a family forged by choice, tested by adversity, and strengthened by love that had grown from the most practical of seeds into something worth any sacrifice. The family portrait lay propped against the kitchen table, its charcoal lines capturing a moment of quiet contentment that Abigail had sketched during Thomas's afternoon nap. In the drawing, Silas sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, their 6-month-old son balanced on his knee while she stood behind them, her hand resting on Silas's shoulder. It wasn't a formal pose, just the three of them as they were on any given evening, comfortable in their shared space and easy with each other in ways that had taken time to develop. "That's good work," Silas said, examining the portrait over her shoulder. "You've captured something real there." "I wanted to remember this," Abigail replied, adding a few final touches to Thomas's round face. "How it feels right now, with everything settled and peaceful." Spring had come early to the mountains, bringing with it news that Marshal Kane had successfully apprehended Stone's remaining associates. The men had been tried in the territorial court and sentenced to long prison terms, finally ending the threat that had shadowed Silas for 8 years. The official pardon had arrived by mail 2 weeks later, along with a bank draft for compensation that was more generous than either of them had expected. "Hard to believe it's been a year since I knocked on your door with that proposition," Silas said, settling into his chair and reaching for Thomas, who had begun to fuss in his cradle. "Seems like a lifetime ago." Abigail set down her charcoal and watched as their son immediately quieted in his father's arms. Thomas had inherited Silas's steady temperament along with his dark hair, but his eyes were her own warm brown, and he had a way of studying the world around him that suggested he'd inherited intelligence from both parents. The cabin had grown over the winter, with Silas adding a room that would serve as a nursery and workspace. He'd also built a proper workshop where he could pursue the woodworking that had produced Thomas's cradle, a high chair, and several toys that showed the same careful craftsmanship as the doll he'd carved for his lost daughter Rose. "I've been thinking," Silas said, bouncing Thomas gently on his knee, "about what comes next for us." "What do you mean?" "The territorial government has offered me a position as a federal marshal for this district. The pay would be good, and it would mean we could afford to expand the homestead, maybe build a real house instead of just adding rooms to the cabin." Abigail considered this, studying his face for clues about how he felt about the opportunity. What would it involve? Mostly keeping the peace in the remote areas, tracking down wanted men, settling disputes between settlers and miners. I'd be away sometimes, but not for long periods. He paused, adjusting Thomas's position. The thing is, I'm not sure I want to spend my time chasing other men's problems when I could be here, building something with you and Thomas, and any other children we might have, Abigail added quietly. Silas looked up at her sharply. You... Not yet, but I hope to be again someday. Thomas deserves brothers and sisters, and we have room for a larger family now. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, they could see a small group of riders making their way up the mountain trail. A man and woman with 2 children, all looking travel-weary but determined. Expecting company? Silas asked, automatically checking the position of his rifle. No, but they don't look like trouble. Abigail moved to the window for a better view. The woman's carrying a baby, and the man's leading a pack horse loaded with household goods. They look like settlers. When Silas opened the door to greet the newcomers, the man removed his hat respectfully. Mr. McGraw, I'm James Morrison, and this is my wife Elizabeth. We heard in town that you might have advice for folks looking to homestead in these mountains. Advice? Silas glanced back at Abigail, who had moved to stand in the doorway with Thomas in her arms. About where to find good land, what to expect from the winters, how to survive up here. Morrison's voice carried the respectful tone of a man asking for help from someone whose reputation preceded him. The territorial office said you knew these mountains better than anyone. Elizabeth Morrison stepped forward, bouncing her fussing. Infant, we've got savings enough to buy land and supplies, but we need to know we're not walking into something we can't handle. We heard you and your wife have built a good life up here, despite the challenges. Abigail and Silas exchanged a look of understanding. These weren't the first settlers who'd sought them out for advice, and they probably wouldn't be the last. Word had spread that the McGraws had not only survived in the remote mountains, but had thrived, building a homestead that could serve as a model for other families brave enough to try frontier life. Come in, Abigail said, stepping aside to let them enter. You look like you could use a hot meal and a chance to rest. As Elizabeth Morrison settled her children near the fire and accepted the cup of coffee Abigail offered, she looked around the cabin with obvious appreciation. This is exactly what we hoped to find. A real home, not just a place to survive. It took time, Silas said honestly, and there were moments when we weren't sure we'd make it through. But if you're willing to work hard and help each other, it's possible to build something lasting up here. Later that evening, after the Morrison family had set up camp near the cabin and settled in for the night, Abigail and Silas sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. You never answered my question. About the martial position, Abigail said, leaning against his shoulder. I think my answer is right here, he replied, gesturing toward the peaceful scene before them. We've got settlers coming to us for advice, a son who'll grow up knowing these mountains, and the chance to build something that will last long after we're gone. Why would I want to trade that for a badge and the problems that come with it? Thomas made a contented sound from where he dozed in his mother's arms, and Abigail smiled at the portrait they made. A family that had grown from the most practical of beginnings into something neither of them had dared to hope for when they'd first spoken their wedding vows. From tonight on, she said softly, echoing the words that had started their journey together, we exist to build something beautiful. And in the gathering twilight, with their son sleeping peacefully between them and the mountains standing eternal, watch over their small corner of the world both of them knew they already had.